This morning, we want to talk about Christianity and music, and particularly the impact that our faith, the true faith, has had on the development of music in Christian civilization. And to do that, we'll listen a little bit to some contrast between Christian music and non-Christian music, and then ask ourselves what accounts for those differences. Now, this builds on what we said last night about man's purpose in the world to imitate God by bringing the world from glory to glory. So that as history moves along, music has developed in complexity and in richness as the other arts have. And if we follow many Presbyterian theologians, we would say that the human race still has, the Christian church and the Christian human race still has many centuries left to go to develop this even further. But regardless of whether you believe that Christ is coming soon or a long time from now, the fact is that over the centuries, music has developed, and it has developed along certain lines. And that's what we want to look at today, this morning. Now I want to discuss 7 themes. Okay, so if you're taking notes, there will be 7 sections. And with 30 minutes for each section, we'll be done around 11. No, it won't take that long. 7 theological, philosophical conceptions that play into the development of Christian music. But let me say also this at the outset. We tend to be very intellectualistic as Christians and think of doctrines only as things that you understand. But the fact is the Bible doesn't present a view of man that allows for that. The Bible doesn't present us a view of man as made up of a mind and a body. And it's 2 separate things linked up like stacked up on top of each other. And the mind apprehends doctrine, and the rest of our personality goes its own way. Rather, what the Bible says is that the human beings are a unity, and that unity has a number of dimensions to it. And we can speak of those dimensions as soul and body, or we can speak of those dimensions as spirit, soul, and body if we were to use a tabernacle model, innermost man, middle man, and outer man. There are any number of different ways the Bible has of speaking of the human person because we are complex, being made in God's image. When we believe certain things and live in terms of certain things, they impact us totally. So I'm going to talk about some theological ideas, but at the outset, let's not just think of these as ideas that the mind apprehends, but as things that totally impact the human personality in culture. And the first of these themes is the question of unity and diversity. Unity and diversity. What I mean by that is the fact that there's a lot of different people in this room, and yet they're one body in Christ. The question of unity and diversity has to do with the connections among things, what makes it possible for things to connect to each other and yet be separate. And in the history of pagan thought, you have a tendency to fall off either into saying that everything is one and that the differences among things don't really count, or else that everything is chaotic and everything is different from everything else and there's no unity in the world. Now, music gives us a good picture of how unity and diversity work together because there are basically 6, we'll call them 6 anyway, 6 elements of music, not 3. Because there's melody, harmony, and rhythm. Then there are 3 other things at least. In addition to melody, which you know what that is, and harmony, that's the chord structures that go along with melodies. And rhythm, that's the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's also dynamics. Dynamics has to do with whether the music is loud or soft. And that's all music has dynamics. All music is either loud or soft or goes back and forth between the two. So that's a 4th element. Any piece of music, a composer or performer has to integrate his melody, his harmony, his rhythm, and his dynamics, and his tempo. Tempo is whether the music is fast or slow. See, rhythm is the beat, but the beat can be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And this is the same rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But it's faster. So in music you have to integrate melody and harmony and rhythm and dynamics and tempo. And there's one other element that's always there in music, and that's what we call timbre, T-I-M-B-R-E, or tone color. Just as there's green and red and pink and white colors in here, so there are different tone colors. What that means is that clarinets don't sound like violins. Sopranos don't sound like altos. The vowel E doesn't sound like the vowel A. E, A, A, those are different timbres of sound. And if you play a piece on the piano, it has one timbre or tone color. If you play the same piece in a string choir, it has a different timbre or tone color. Now, if you're a composer, you have to integrate all 6 of these things into one musical experience. But when you hear music, if you just listen to it without distinguishing, you don't sit there and analyze all of these things. They just come at you. Now, in paganism, there doesn't tend to be a very rich integration of these factors. It tends to be fairly chaotic. Let me give you an example. Have you ever tried to listen to classical music in your car? How many of you tune in the classical station or listen to classical music in the car? You ever frustrated by that? Because it gets soft. And when the music gets soft, you can't hear it in the car. You don't have that problem with pop music. Pop music doesn't have any dynamic range. If a song starts out at a fairly loud pitch, it stays right there all the way to the end. If it's a soft song, it stays soft to the end. The classical music gets loud and soft. Now they have CDs, it gets very loud and very soft. I heard a guy putting a CD in his car. There are cars with CDs, and I thought, why? What we need is classical music where the sound is compressed between loud and soft for cars. We need to make special tapes for us. But at any rate, that's an area in which more complex, more highly developed music integrates more unity and diversity. Let's say you're a composer. Just let me show you how much there is. How many different instruments are there in a symphony orchestra or groups? You have first violins, second violins. You have the first chair violinist and the second chair violinist. And that's 4 potentially different musical parts. The cello and the first chair cellist and the double basses. So you basically got 7 possible things that can go on there. You have flutes, oboes, English horns, clarinets, brass instruments, percussion instruments. Now, in a piece of classical music, all of those things are integrated together. A symphony will start off with one melody, and then there'll be a second melody, and normally a third melody. These are worked together. They're played in different keys, that is, in different harmonies in the course of one movement. Then the second movement comes in, and generally there's one melody, and then it's played over and over again, but with variations each time. Changes in harmony, changes in dynamics, changes in timbre, as one variation is played by strings, another variation is played by flutes. You go to the third movement, and it's a dance movement, and it has 2 sections. A faster dance section and a quieter section, and a return of the faster dance section. So there's 2 different melodies there. The fourth movement. Now all 4 of these movements have to be organized together to where they make sense. It doesn't make sense to take Beethoven's Second Symphony, first movement, Fifth Symphony, second movement, Seventh Symphony, third movement, Ninth Symphony, fourth movement. Wouldn't work. So even though these are separate movements with spaces of silence in between, they're unified. Now you begin to get a picture of how unity and diversity works in well-developed music. And even if a piece is very simple, say an art song by a great composer, in the background is an understanding of all of that unity and diversity. And out of that huge range of possibilities that the composer is familiar with, he selects 1 or 2 things to put together. If it's a chamber piece for bassoon and clarinet only by Villalobos or somebody, and it only lasts 5 minutes, still he has selected to use the bassoon and selected to use the clarinet because he knows among all the possibilities there are, he can isolate those 2 and put them together. So it's a little bit different than if I tried to do it because I might only know about 1 or 2 things. If all I can play is the guitar, and I'm not aware of anything else, all I can write for is the guitar, and I might write pretty good music. But you see what an education does here, and how knowing all of this unity and diversity being able to select just a couple of things enhances your ability to do music. Now, in paganism, in pagan philosophy, because non-believers and say pre-Christian people, because they're people, they can't escape this. And so their music always has a certain amount of beauty to it, and it always has a certain amount of unity and diversity. But over the course of time, it will tend either to go into chaos-sounding music or into music that's so simple and repetitious that there's no diversity. The tendency will be to fall into repetition and lack of diversity, or into chaos and lack of order. Kind of like this. Let's hear some pagan music. This is really nice stuff. If you like it, that's fine, because it's made by people in the image of God who can't escape that. But there's not a whole lot that this music can develop into over time. This is Chinese music. We'll see how it works today on the speakers. Jeff Myers. Well, I know, but we had to stop it somewhere. Did that sound chaotic to you? Well, partly the reason it did is because you're not used to it. It's actually got organization to it, of a sense. There was repetition. There were ideas that were repeated over and over. There were rhythms that kept going until it kind of broke down in the middle, and it kind of dissolved into chaos and then started back up again a little bit different. So the transition from part A to part B was just dissolve it all into a mess and then start something else up again. It was more or less the way this worked. Now, if we were more familiar with this music, we would hear more to it. But there's a big gap between that and what Bach can do or what Handel can do for a festival occasion. That's Chinese festival music. Now, I don't want to play you Handel's Water music because you've heard music like that, but that's also festival music, but it's much more unity and diversity involved there. Now, don't go away from here thinking that I'm saying or that you should believe that pagan music doesn't have any unity and diversity and that Christian music does. What we're saying is that it's only under the influence of the Holy Spirit and under the impact of the doctrine of the Trinity, where God is three in one, and the living in community in the church, where we live as many in one, that people become remade totally. Over the course of time, people become new and different over the generations. Because God is three in one, unity and diversity, and the community of the church is three in one, or many in one. One body, many parts, many people. And as we grow, that impacts us, and over the course of time, Christianity produces music that has a great deal more diversity, pulled down and unified much better. That's the first point. Second is, Christianity gives us a doctrine of cause and effect that paganism tends not to have. Christianity says that history is real, history has a beginning, history makes real progress from glory to glory as a result of God's work and our work, and that history is not a series of random events that don't make sense, and the only thing that makes sense is in the other world. Now, when you look at life, because God is sovereign and we don't know what God is doing, many times it seems as if history is a series of random things that don't make sense. Bad things come into our lives, horrible things come into our lives, and all we can do is trust in God and in the world to come. And that's the message of the book of Ecclesiastes. That we are not omniscient and we can't figure out everything that goes on in history. So the bottom line is there's nothing better to do than to eat and drink and be merry before God. And that's what Ecclesiastes means. He means come into church and eat and drink and rejoice before God. Even if you don't understand anything, you can receive God's good gifts and rejoice before Him and trust in the world to come. But the fact is, for the most part, we understand that situations like that are not always going on. We can understand that if our country continues to go the way it's going, we're going to fall apart. Okay? We understand cause and effect. Now, in pure paganism, there tends not to be any doctrine of cause and effect. Maybe you've read the Iliad at some time in the past. Well, there's a scene early on in the Iliad where Paris is on the battlefield and he's about to get killed, and so one of the goddesses just picks him up and takes him magically back to the palace where Helen is. Now that doesn't happen in real life, and it's not caused by anything. It's just a random occurrence. I've had missionaries tell me stories about situations where they'll go into a culture and the people will plant their crops by the river, and every year the river comes and floods and washes away their crops, and they come back and plant them in the same place year after year, and they don't draw from it that they should plant the crop somewhere else because next year might be different. They're not used to thinking in cause and effect patterns. And the reason for that is that in non-Christian religions there's no doctrine of creation. The doctrine of creation says God caused the world. And that means that you and I, as images of God, cause things to happen. But in non-Christian religion, there's no creation out of nothing. There's only eternal being. Just being. And being just kind of bees all the time. And sometimes it bees this way and sometimes it bees that way, but there's no real cause and effect. And the only thing, Aristotle says, the only thing that makes being different is pure chance. Every now and then, pure chance without any cause behind it at all. Pure chance makes things change. And then pure chance makes them change back. Now, if you really think that way, what kind of music do you come up with? Well, it's music that doesn't really start anywhere coherently, doesn't develop along very well, and doesn't have any way to end. Because it doesn't have much cause and effect in it. And that's true in the rest of life. Now, all people are people. Very few people are philosophers. And so, your non-Christian out there in early Europe or wherever else he may have been is unable not to write music that has some cause and effect in it. But it's not going to have a whole lot. The second thing we can say about cause and effect, beyond the fact that history is real because of the doctrine of creation, is that history is purposeful. And our understanding of history as purposeful generates in us a historical consciousness, an awareness of long periods of time. Instead of just living day to day and expecting things to be different today or different tomorrow and having a very present orientation, we learn to think in long sweeps of time. Started with Father Abraham. Abraham, 400 years from now, your children will inherit this land. Okay, this is 1989. 400 years ago was 1589. Do you know what was going on then? It was a long time ago. Suppose you were told 400 years from now your children will inherit Huntsville. Can you really plan that far ahead? Do you have historical consciousness? Now, the ability to think over a period of time and to come to grips with long spans of time in terms of purpose, cause and effect, building, gradually developing toward a goal, gives in Western music what is sometimes called the long line. That is, music can start and go and have a long line of progression. It might last 10 minutes or it might last an hour. A symphony might. But it will start with a certain idea and move all the way through to the end through a lot of changes, but still coherently. The mind is able to grasp a long pattern of sound with a lot of diversity in it that makes sense. Now, that's not just an idea. That comes from a liturgy in the church. We're not as familiar with that, but for centuries in the church, the liturgy was an artistic event that lasted about an hour or so. It was it was organized artistically, and it was a progression of experience of prayer. Started with a call into God's presence, moved into a confession of sin, into a cycle of praise, into a hearing of the Word of God, and more praise and more prayers, and into communion and more praise and more prayers. Very logically, in terms of the covenant renewal patterns that the Bible sets out. Now, tomorrow I'm going to talk about this, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But there is a covenant renewal pattern in the Bible that's in the Lord's Supper. It's in Genesis chapter 1. It's in the Bible every time the covenant is renewed. And that is the order and progression of the liturgy in the ancient church. And people who grow up with that and who are used to going every Sunday to a worship service that lasts an hour and is one long artistic event with a flow that starts with a lot of tension because we're scared to come into God's house and ends with a tremendous relaxation because we don't want to leave and we have to be sent out. We just sat down and had dinner with Jesus, and now who wants to leave? You have to be dismissed. That progression impacts society in a way that going into a Buddhist temple and just sitting there thinking all by yourself doesn't. Moreover, the liturgy was a communal experience. In pagan religion, you don't have any communal experiences. You just go and make your deal with the God. Pay him money, so he'll give you this woman. Pay you money, so he'll give you a good crop. Or just go in there and think for a while, or meditate, or look at your neighbor. But it's not community experience. You don't share bread and wine. You don't pass anything from one person to the one next to you. Now, I'm rambling a little bit, but what I want you to get is some type of a feel that in Christianity, there's a community that becomes aware and becomes used to thinking in things in terms of cause and effect. Now, I want to play you a piece of music from Java. The first piece we played was from China. That is music that was not influenced by Christianity at all. And it didn't have any kind of a long line. It had some interesting parts to it. It kind of beat its way along, and then it fell apart, and it beat its way along again. And if the people were marching through the street, dressed like a dragon or whatever, they can beat this out and do it. And there's a certain amount of long-lineness to that because they're human beings living in God's world, and you can't escape it. There's not much development. Now, the piece you're about to hear is from Java, and Java is part of Indonesia. And what country ruled Indonesia for a couple of hundred years? The Netherlands, that's right. And was that a Calvinistic country? Yes. And because of the Western influences that came into Java, the Javanese and Balinese musicians took all their native instruments and formed their own little folk orchestras out of them that are called gamelan orchestras. So this is a gamelan, G-A-M-E-L-A-N, gamelan orchestra. A lot of 20th century classical music has been influenced by this, but before classical music was influenced by it, this was influenced by classical music. What you'll hear here is there's a certain line to it, but there's not a whole lot of motion to it. It's just music to kind of contemplate and groove out on. Okay? That wasn't hard enough. That was the really good part. some more of it in a minute. But before we do, I want to go to the third area that I want to talk about. It's very similar to what we just did. We've said, first of all, that the experience that we have with a God who is three in one causes us as Christians, over the course of time, to be able to handle more and more diversity and pull it together into more and more unity. We grow both in our understanding of how different everything is and in how united we are. You know, when you first became a Christian, if you did as an adult, you remember how you had a sense that you were more of a unique person than you ever were before. The closer we go to God, the more unique we become. And yet, the more unique we become, the more able we are to function in unity with other Christians. You see how we're growing in both diversity and unity simultaneously. And that impacts music. The second thing we said is that Christianity has a doctrine of cause and effect. And that means that we begin to understand long lines of sound. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is the doctrine of the Sabbath, because that relates to this. And that is that as Christians we have a rhythm of tension and rest in life. A rhythm of tension and rest in life. And that we talked about this last night. We work 6 days, we rest the seventh. We work, we produce something, we bring it to God. There are times in life where we draw things to an end, and then we go on. Now, in Western music, this has given rise to what's called a cadence in music. Cadences are places where music stops, not by turning off the sound, and not by, as in rock music on the AM radio, just turning the sound down while the music goes on and on. Notice how the music doesn't end in modern pop music? I don't think they quite know how to end it. If you buy a record, sometimes it will just kind of stop. But normally when you listen to it, the sound just is turned down. Because they don't know how to make it end. If you don't have a doctrine of Sabbath functioning in your experience, then you don't know how to end. But see, we do. Let me get a good one here. And I'll just show you how our music ends. Okay. If you want to look at it, look at 207. Okay? That's a cadence. C-A-D-E-N-C-E. A place where music comes to a place of rest. There are a lot of different cadences. That's a kind of cadence. It's a kind of cadence in certain kinds of music. This goes on. That's an incomplete cadence, isn't it? See how that ends for you? Now let's listen to how this piece from Java ends. Incompletely Christianized type of piece. about 5 or 6 of those records. I really like that music. I should say it's great to smoke dope too, but I won't say that. I have no idea about that. But it's real pleasant to listen to. It's nice music. I like international folk and ethnic music, but it's not highly well developed, okay? And we're trying to account this morning for what Christianity has done for music. It gives a sense of cause and effect so that motion is not just kind of spinning itself along here, a bunch of guys grooving on these various xylophones and whatnot in the gamelan orchestra. And it's able to end without just fading out. Now I want to give you an example of Western music that illustrates, I think, the long line idea. Okay. And this is a piece that probably none of you have ever heard before. It's Alan Paterson's Second Violin Concerto. It's a piece that has one movement, lasts about 55 minutes long, and we won't listen to but about 30 minutes of it. We'll only listen to about 5 minutes of it or less. But he uses a song that he's written, a religious song, as his melody. And what you'll hear, and this just is a real easy example of a long line because the melody is in the violin, so you'll just hear this melody go on and on and on. And even though this is 20th century music, and so it's going to sound lush and romantic in places and also kind of just jarring and discordant in places, okay? Minor theme and major theme. Remember from last night? Even though it's that kind of music, I think you can hear the long line. Now, actually, this is a very interesting piece of music. For the first 40 minutes of this violin concerto, this religious song is being played, but you can barely hear it because the orchestra is making all this chaotic noise for 40 minutes. And then, after about 40 minutes, it completely reverses, and the violin takes over and plays this melody, and the orchestra is defeated. It's like a conversion takes place. And the major theme predominates, and the orchestra kind of gets itself in line, although it continues to erupt with sound every now and then. So if you use your imagination, as I think that this piece is intended for you to do, it's as if you become a Christian, but there's still sin and problems in your life. But what you'll hear in this is, a couple of minutes at the 40-minute mark, and then the last couple of minutes of the piece altogether. And just give you a feel for how Western music works with the long line. Full orchestra, a lot of unity and diversity, and a long line of sound that just spins itself along coherently. There's a million examples, and I just pulled this one out because it's different from what you'd normally hear. Now, be honest. Did any of you find that a little bit hard to listen to? I think the reason is that we are not used to listening to music that has a long span of time involved in it. We're very accustomed to music that comes in short bites. But if you would take the time, it would have been a lot of fun to do this, but it would have taken another bunch of time out of us. Get Brahms' First Symphony, and listen to it, and use your imagination to imagine that when the first movement starts out, you're confronted with a man possessed by a bunch of devils, and that the music exorcises this, and that in the fourth movement, by the time you get to the fourth movement and the man has lived his life for a while, that he becomes a Christian, he sings a chorale, he gets up and he marches forth to serve Christ, and at the end of the movement, as he dies, he goes to heaven and sings the chorale again. Now, that's not what Brahms had in mind, but you see, as Christians, we're the heirs of everything anybody's ever did, and it all belongs to us, and we can use it any way we want. That's true. So you don't have to use it the way they wanted it. And you can use your imagination and making an analogy between life and the long line of a human life and a piece of music will make you able to understand the psychological meaning of classical music that incorporates the long line. Okay, I want to move on to a couple of other points before we're done today. We've talked about the long line, cause and effect, tension and rest. A fourth thing that Christianity provides for music is so common and simple and obvious that you wouldn't think of it, but Christianity gave the impetus for music to be written. Other cultures don't write music. And the reason, that several reasons come together, but one is we're a religion of a book. And so after a while, the impress of the Christian consciousness was such that music began to be written down, and musical notation was invented. And there's a whole history of notation, but the history of notation isn't the history of music in China. It's the history of music in the West. Now,
I saw three ships come sailing in on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. I saw three ships come sailing in on Christmas Day in the morning.
And what was this little ship so free on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day? And what was this little ship so free on Christmas Day in the morning?
Our Savior Christ and His Lady on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. Our Savior Christ and His Lady on Christmas Day in the morning.
They made the sailor ship so free on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. They made the sailor ship so free on Christmas Day in the morning.
Oh, they sailed into Bethlehem on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. Oh, they sailed into Bethlehem on Christmas Day in the morning. And there, the ring on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. And there, the ring on Christmas Day in the morning.
And all the angels sang on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. And all the angels sang on Christmas Day in the morning.
And there's a sorry joy for me on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. And there's a sorry joy for me on Christmas Day in the morning. Oh, Tannenbaum, wie bräuchlich deine Blätter. Du riechst nicht zur Sommerzeit, nein, auch im Winter.
we all get together and sing, and we sing worship music, which means we have to learn it and teach it to the next generation. And those factors impel music to be written down. If your religion only consists of going and having a private deal with your God or meditating, you don't need to. But the Christian idea of permanence, of progress over time, of living in community, and just the general psychological impact of writing in a literate society resulted in music being written. Now, once music starts being written down, it's possible to pass it on from generation to generation and begin to build on it. And that's part of where our classical music comes from, is out of the impact of Christianity in creating musical writing and enabling generations to build on each other. Okay, so that's the fourth way in which Christianity has impacted Western music and made it different. Number 5. All right. Number 5 is that Christianity says that the world is not divine. That means that musical sounds are not divine. And that means that we can take dominion over them. Now, in non-Christian religions, the tendency is to view nature as divine. And so you're afraid of nature. And you don't take much dominion over nature. You may have to fight nature, but basically what you try to do is become united with nature. And all the nature religions were designed to study the rhythms of the creation, the rhythms of the stars, the rhythms of the fertility of the season, and then somehow or other get in harmony with nature. Because if you can get in harmony with nature and in harmony with natural laws, then you can live better. And that means that nature is over man. And you don't manipulate nature very much, and you don't develop technology, and you don't develop clocks to take dominion over time. You ever talk to missionaries and have them talk about how time is viewed in non-Christian cultures? They have no sense of time at all, hardly. They have some, but very, very little. Where were clocks made in the Western world? Geneva. The more Christian you become, the more dominion over time you take. The more technology you develop, because nature is no longer mystical and fearful and full of gods. Well, music is full of gods. Music is vibrations, and music influences you. And if you're not a Christian, your view of music tends to be that music is something you become a part of, not something that you take dominion over. So music is used for enchantment, the way it is in a rock concert environment today in our culture, although we're not back where they are. But you go and the music is there and you smoke your hashish or something and you become part of this environment and you come under the vibrations, under the sound of music, and you don't take dominion over it. Now, somebody has to make music. You can become very skilled at it, but your idea about it is not to take dominion over it and manipulate it. There's always a fear, a respect, a desire to come under the natural sounds of music. I don't know if I'm communicating this very well, but the other side of that is what Christianity does is it breaks with all these mystical views of music, any Pythagorean views of music, any fear of the power of music, and it takes dominion over music and starts to produce it practically. Okay? Plato said that music was dangerous. You ought not to use music because music is so influential on the emotions, and that was bad. We should be all mind and no emotion, according to Plato. So get rid of music. Then one of the Protestant reformers, Huldrych Zwingli, said the same thing. Shouldn't have any music in church at all because it stirs people's emotions up and it's dangerous. Okay? Afraid of the world. Christianity puts us in dominion over the world. And now you have a little chart there that shows you an extended version of the three dimensions of the kingdom we talked about last night. The sanctuary, the home, and the world. And Christianity enables to take dominion over these areas and to enhance and beautify them with music. Let me pull this piece of paper out. For instance, let's talk about dominion now, because that's the theme. Dominion. How does music relate to dominion? Okay, on your chart here, let's look first of all at the land, the second category, land. And there are basically two areas that the Bible speaks of in terms of the land. One is the home, and one is the nation. If you look at the book of Leviticus, you'll find that chapters 1 through 10 are laws for the sanctuary, and then chapters 11 through 15 give how to keep your house clean, and then chapters 17 through 22 talk about how to keep the nation clean. And these things are both in the land area. Well, what kinds of family music are there? What kinds of domestic music are there? Lullabies, okay. That's a real good example. Okay? Lullabies don't come into the sanctuary. Lullaby-type music isn't normally found out in the workplace. You don't whistle lullabies while you work. Okay? It's here. Now, the reason I want you to reflect on this is there's certain kinds of styles of music and singing that go with our language, and there will be different styles with different languages. But is that style of lullaby music really what you want in worship? No. Is it what you want when you're marching in the military? No. See, there are different zones of life. There's diversity. And there are different kinds of music to go with each one. We take dominion over music. What are some examples of national type music in the land? Home and land. I've mentioned one or two. Okay, marches. Military marches would be one. National anthems would be one. All right? Pardon? Folk music. Folk music is kind of in between here, home and land. Social events. Okay? You get a bunch of people together to fiddle, and it's kind of like a clan or something. But it fits in this area real well. Okay, what are some world kinds of music? The outlying world, I've said, is the world of work and evangelism. For our purposes, let's put in parentheses next to evangelism the world of study. Okay, learning about the world. Okay, obviously work songs fit in here. You sing while you work. Americans don't. It's kind of hard to sing while you're typing on a computer. But it used to be that you sang while you worked on the railroad or wherever else you worked. There are all these laboring songs. Okay? And now there's music that explores just the nature of vibrations and sound themselves. And that's what we tend to think of as art music. Art music is more or less music that's primarily oriented toward understanding, or very closely, in a very broad sense. Understanding life or understanding tones. Understanding and beautifying tones. We go to a concert, we sit there, and we listen to music performed out there. It's not part of our work. It's not part of our lullabies. It's not something we march to. It's not part of worship. It's an experience of music itself. And that's perfectly fine. But that's part of dominion over the world, because the world of musical vibrations is part of the world. We can do that too. Now look up at your chart, and I've got two areas of the sanctuary in the Garden of Eden. And we could, if you studied the Old Testament, if you buy my book, it's all in there. There are only a couple of copies left, so run. You'll find that the tabernacle, which is the house of God, was always put in a garden courtyard. Only the priests came in here, but citizens could come in here. And there's an inner court and an outer court aspect to the church. Well, we can make a distinction between music that's appropriate for the inner sanctuary and music that's appropriate for the outer sanctuary. And that's a distinction I think that's important, that's being overlooked these days. The idea is that any kind of Christian music, any kind of music that talks about Jesus, any style of Christian music belongs in worship. They don't all belong in worship. Some of them just belong when Christians get together. Your hymnal has hymns for informal occasions. That distinction is valid. It's not theologically real precise in the Trinity hymnal. For centuries, what the church maintained was that you sang mainly psalms in worship, because that's mainly what God wanted to hear. Does your wife like red dresses or green dresses? You're going to buy jewelry for your wife. Do you know what kind she likes? Well, God likes psalms, because He wrote them. So that's what He'd rather hear. Now, there have been times when it's been exclusive psalmody. Only psalms can be sung in worship. I don't think we have to go that far. The Bible doesn't lay down laws here. But certainly, we should have preponderant songs. But how about if Christians get together for an all-day sing? Can we sing Sacred Heart songs in an all-day sing? Sure. Can you sing Jesus songs in an all-day sing? Sure. Can you listen to Amy Grant on the radio? Sure. You can listen to that stuff all day long. It's outer court type music. But we need to think. You need to think. And you can draw the line wherever you want. I can't draw the line for you, and I don't live in Huntsville, and I'm not in your church. And you have to draw your line where it makes sense to you and where the Spirit leads you to. But you need to have some awareness that there's some kinds of things that belong in formal worship, central worship, where only men can lead. And there are also things that you can do in the outer court where you can have a lot more looseness in the church. In the medieval church, they had miracle plays and mystery plays on Sunday afternoons in the church. Remember how the church was the center of society? And they would have plays in the church. They'd have put straw down the aisle, and the donkey would come in with Mary and Joseph on him and have these plays in church. They didn't do that in worship. And you do too, you know. You have programs. I'm calling on you to think a little bit about what belongs in inner sanctuary worship, what kinds of texts and what kinds of music are most appropriate, and then what kinds of things are preferable for outer court Christian events. Sunday nights, informal occasions, Christian parties, etc. Okay, I've only brought these things up. We'll talk about them a little bit more tomorrow when we talk about the Psalms and we talk about worship. We'll talk about them some more tonight when we talk about what's happened to Christian music. But remember this model. There are different events in life and different music to enhance different kinds of events. And the reason we don't feel good about having dance music in church is because we're not having a social dance in church. And the kind of music we use, have developed, that associates with dance doesn't belong in church. The liturgy is a different kind of dance. It's a ballet that we do before the throne of God, and He's the audience. And it's not done to make us feel good. It's done to praise Him. It may be hard to do. You may have to learn to do it. Maybe not. Yes. What you're saying is that music, when it's pulled from one context to another, is very disturbing, and that's correct. And I agree with you. But it doesn't matter. Let's say that A Mighty Fortress was originally a barroom song. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's suppose it was. It doesn't make any difference to us because we never sang it that way. But There Is a Ship or The House of the Rising Sun does matter to us because we do know what that is and we do have associations with it. So if the associations are alive, it matters. The O Sacred Head Now Wounded was originally a part song, the text of which was, "My heart is broken because my love is gone," or something like that, correct? Okay. Now that might have been jarring 600 years ago, but it doesn't make any difference now. As I recall, A Mighty Fortress was a pre-composed song by Luther. I don't think any of the German chorales came from bar songs. They mostly came from Gregorian chant. Luther said, "Why should the devil have all the best music?" Well, if you know Luther, he didn't associate the bar with the devil. He loved beer. When he says, "Why should the devil have the best music?" he meant Gregorian chant. He meant the Pope. The Pope was the devil to Luther. And almost all of our German chorales, like the one I played a minute ago. Let's just stop and do this for a second. Let's see. Is that right? I didn't know that. This gentleman here has a PhD in Renaissance music performance. So he is an expert on the Reformation period in music. We're glad to have him, and he's going to help me. Number 207. The melody is this. That comes from a Gregorian chant melody from about 300 years earlier that went. That's the Gregorian chant. And it came into a late medieval hymn called Christus et Schanem that went. Okay? Then Luther came along and he did this. Okay? That's where it comes from. Over 400 or 500 years, and we were told that one of the Genevan tunes uses basically the same melody. But we'll have to figure out which one it is. 43. Okay. Okay. So that's where these come from. And it's interesting that Luther, with all of his hostility to the Roman Church, didn't feel it incongruous to pull over that music into his church. And we'll have to look at why that is. Why that is. And it's because there should be continuity in sanctuary music. We should be drawing our Christian music, our church music, out of the heritage of church music and not out of commercial styles in America today, which is what we tend to do. We tend to think we're Americans first and Christians second, instead of Christians first and Americans second. And that is an important issue that I want to talk about a little bit more. Now let's talk. I want to finish up on this business of dominion over sound. And here again, I won't say a little bit more about this tonight, but because each of these areas reflects the glory of God in its own way, and the kingdom pattern comes to expression in the home one way, and in the land another way, and in the world another way, and in fine arts another way, and in the outer court this way, and in the inner court that way, and they're all the basic heaven pattern being realized in different ways. For that reason, there's no tyranny of the sanctuary over the world. In Roman Catholicism, there tended to be, as we'll see tonight, a tyranny of the artistic principles of the church over everything else. But it's perfectly legitimate to have separate artistic developments in all of these areas, provided that we remember that we're Christians and the worship is the center of life. Okay. So, now what have we said? We've said that Christianity enables us to take dominion over the use of music. We can use music the same way we use a tool. In a sense, music is a tool to glorify life. And you don't need to be afraid of it. And there is nothing in rock music that influences people in the least. Well, there's a lot in rock culture that influences people. But if you go to a rock concert, the kids are screaming before the musician even appears on the stage. The music didn't stir them up. It's not the beat. There's more beat in Bach than there is in rock. Okay? This idea that floats into our circles from people who are legitimately terribly upset about rock culture and are saying, what's wrong with it? What can we do about it? And they say, it's the beat, or it's this or it's that. What they're saying is that there's power in these vibrations to make you into something. That we're like computers and we're being fed a chip that changes us. That's not true. If you were to go to a third world culture and people are going to become enchanted, they go into a room and the music is there's no beat at all, and yet people are all tripping out on it. Okay? Shame. Because of their expectations. It's faith and attitude that makes the difference. Christianity says the things themselves are not what matters, it's the heart, attitude, and faith of sin that matters. And with that, if we rivet that attitude in our mind, we just use music properly for different things. But we're sensitive to the cultural effects of it. Okay. The next point, because that'll help. And that is that we want to talk about good and bad music. Our problem is that as American Protestants, we really only think in terms of law. Is it lawful or is it unlawful? Is it right or is it wrong in a moral sense? And we're not used to thinking in terms of glory or degradation as categories. And what I tried to establish last night is that there are words and beliefs that we can evaluate in terms of true and false, right and wrong, moral and immoral. And then there are other questions in life that are not right or wrong questions. They're questions of glory and degradation, or just lack of glory. For instance, this is an issue that you're going to hear more and more about, is whether it's appropriate to practice family planning. And there's now a movement that says it's always wrong. You should have as many children as you should possibly have. The problem is that the Bible doesn't teach that. But you've got another problem out here on the side, that so many Christians are not having children at all because they want to live yuppie lifestyles and just go to Europe every year and just not have kids and be materialists. So, faced with this problem, what is it that people want to do? They want to come up with a law that says you have to have as many children as you can possibly have. It's sinful ever to use birth control. Well, that is a category mistake. Okay? First thing we would have to say to that is, the Bible has nothing to say about that in particular. It tells the human race to multiply, but it doesn't tell everybody that he has to get married. Some people can be eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. Some people can be married and not have kids for the kingdom's sake if they're called to be missionaries or any other thing. What does the Bible say? Well, it says that having a lot of kids is glorious. And normally you want glory. But Jesus chose to set aside glory, so you can choose to set aside glory. And it really isn't anybody's business, and I shouldn't even be talking about it. Okay? But it's a glory question, not a law question. And the question of music is really a glory question. What are we glorifying with our music? Now, what is rock music glorifying? A lifestyle of promiscuity. Not always. I know that there's some rock music that's not. But I mean, when we think of bad rock music, we're glorifying a lifestyle of promiscuity, dope addiction, revolution, a thoroughgoing defiance of authority, Satanism, okay? So music is being used to glorify that, and that's bad, see? But now if we use music to glorify the Psalms, that's good. And we can also say this because words influence music. We saw last night how words influence music. Good words will influence music in the direction of greater and greater true glory. And bad words and bad ideas will influence music in a direction of less and less glory. The fact is, rock music is normally really bad music. Okay? It's not bad in the moral sense, but it's sorry in the sense that it doesn't have much of any unity and diversity. It doesn't have much of any cause and effect. It generally is pretty deliberate sounds that are to our ear deliberately ugly. Remember those Chinese sounds? That sounded kind of ugly to us, but it sounds pretty to them. But if you deliberately make those sounds that to us sound ugly, you're trying to tear at something that's part of us. So the music in itself is objectively neutral, but it can be used to glorify bad ideas or to degrade good ideas in terms of a cultural context. And I think that again, in discussing Christianity and music, that's a point that I think it's important for us to make. Music can be good or bad depending on the occasion. See, a lullaby is good music at home when you're rocking your child to sleep, but it's bad music in church. Okay? Uh-huh.
Would you say that we use vibration rock to instruct us on that sacred context that would be issues about music?
There's no reason why a classical composer or a Christian composer can't take the vocabulary of rock music and make use of it. Just as Maurice Ravel takes the vocabulary of jazz music in his piano concertos and uses them. It's just vocabulary. And you can use that vocabulary. That piece John somebody last night is a classical piece, but he uses rock elements. It's kind of a fun piece. But it's just vocabulary. It's musical vocabulary. Vocabulary is not a good word. Musical tones and images that can be used for different purposes. And it's the use and context that is the important factor that we morally react to. Okay? Pastor?
Previous music that we had here, that other thing that we said. I like the song from Bill itself from Deuteronomy 32. Listen, O heaven, and I will keep your earth, the wisdom of my mouth. And after you continued it for several months, he pointed out that two or three of us that in this song, he was a classical artist, he used three different musical idioms. The first was a rock idiom, second was classical hymn type idiom, and the third was country music. Because he said, well, using the different phrases, you could communicate those phrases better through those different idioms. But because we used it in a certain context, nobody noticed there was anything objectionable in the part. You always think it's so much flavor to aware.
Puja. Well, context is what makes most of the difference here. Okay? We are on number 6. The heading was, good and bad music. And by good and bad, we have to talk about glory rather than about morality. Okay? Sure?
I think maybe my difficulty is with the word music. I believe that it is trying to vibration tone sound. That there's nothing right or wrong about the vibration. There's nothing wrong about the wavelength of the vibration. It's certainly how you put those vibrations and tones together. It then presents something that either is music or I think you can say either music or it is not music. And so I think that when me as a contradiction in terms to say rock and music, because rock is a series of sounds and a series of vibrations which I do not believe is the criterion of the definition of music.
Well, I couldn't agree with that. I don't think that we would be able to sustain that distinction very far if you looked into the history of music. But let me summarize this by saying that because your first point, I agree with. There are hidden words behind our music. Okay? Remember we saw last night how closely words are associated with music? So that if we hear on FM radio a Beatles song without any words, and we grew up, when I grew up, then those words are still there. Okay? If you hear modern hard rock music, you may not be able to make out any of the words, but there are words that come to you like revolution, fist in the face of society, devil, Satan. Those words come to you because that's the context in which that takes place. Because you've heard at these rock concerts they're worshiping Satan or whatever. And over 1 million pieces of information coming in over the years, we have formed an opinion about what this impacts us to be. But 1,000 years from now, people might be making music that sounds exactly the same that would mean something different. I doubt it. But, see, the sounds themselves are not the issue. It's their hidden words. It's just... Well, yes. Yes or no. On the one hand, it's true that if you go to a fast food restaurant, the fast music makes you eat fast. If you go to a slow food restaurant, they have slow music to give a different ambiance to the atmosphere. All right. And it's also true that if you listen to a whole lot of loud music, you'll go deaf. If you work on the flight line, you'll go deaf. Okay? Because your ears are bones and they wear out. And it's also true that if you impact yourself with a lot of chaotic vibrations, you can become irritated. It's also true if you read a lot of fiction, you get irritated because you start living in the fictional world. When the kids come in the room and yell at you, you're very irritable because you don't want to be disturbed. I mean, there are a million things that our hearts, because they're desperately wicked and deceit goes way down in here, can abuse all kinds of things. So